Welcome, everyone. I'm Jessica McDonald. I'm the Nancy Inman and Marlene Nathan Meyerson Curator of Photography at the Harry Ransom Center. And today I will be talking with Susan Ressler. Susan is an artist and educator who's been making photographs since the early 1970s. She's Professor Emerita at Purdue University, where she taught from 1981 to 2004. The last several of those years, she was head of the photography area there. She's the recipient of 2 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships. She's the author of the historical volume, Women Artists of the American West, published in 2003. And if you'd like to learn more about her many accolades, we're going to link to her website in our program notes so we don't take more time out of our conversation today. Welcome, Susan.
Welcome to you.
I like your background there. Susan's Zoom background is in fact one of the photographs that we're going to be discussing today. So for all of you out there wondering if she's actually in a 1970s conference room or office of some sort, she is and she isn't. She's not in real time anyway. I just want to give people a little bit of background about why we're talking with you today. So this interview is part of a series around some of our recent acquisitions, and particularly those that fill important gaps in our collection. And we have acquired 5 photographs that you made in 1979 as part of the Los Angeles Documentary Project, an NEA-funded photography survey. And we're going to discuss that project in greater detail in a few moments. First, before we talk about that project, I'd like us to share some context that sort of led up to that project. Some context to the work that you made in the 1970s, late 1970s, in executive offices, by briefly discussing where and when it was that you became interested in photography, and then by looking at your first serious body of work. So I'm just going to sketch a little bit of biographical information. Again, we're going to sort of link out to other materials. You grew up in an upper middle class family in Philadelphia, went on to an undergraduate degree, a firm liberal arts education at the University of Pittsburgh. And that's where a friend of yours introduced you to photography and showed you how to print in the darkroom and kind of introduced you to some basic photography skills, loaned you a Rollie, kind of got you interested in photography. You then went on to Boston after graduation to see if you could make it as a freelance photographer. And did some freelance photography, but also to kind of make ends meet, keep yourself afloat. Like most people, you had to do some other kind of day jobs, and that included some clerical work, both at MIT and at Harvard. Not being shy, you were happy to tell anyone you met there, and this is what you've shared with me, that you were interested in photography and show your work, and so you became acquainted with faculty and students and other people there. And I'm going to let you sort of take the story from there, but it's my understanding that you met a well-known anthropologist who was an ethnographic filmmaker who suggested that you might take this interest of yours and spend a few months photographing on a First Nations reserve in Northern Quebec.
Well, before going up to Quebec, and thank you very much, Jessica, that was a great introduction to my work and very accurate. And so after I graduated from college and went to Boston and was doing this freelance work, the anthropologist I met was named Asen Balixi. And he was actually a professor at the University of Montreal, but he was on leave and spending the year at MIT. And that's how I got to meet him. And he asked me, who wouldn't want to go and take advantage of an opportunity like that? I was 22 years old. The idea of going up to Northern Quebec and living amongst the First Nations peoples up there on a reserve, it was so exciting to me. So I went up there with an anthropology grad student who kind of he spoke the kind of French that the Native Americans up there spoke, and he helped arrange things for me. But really, it was so primitive. I was living in the Canadian National railway operator shack, sleeping on the floor. And this was the first real photo project that I had ever done. And so it was very exciting. And, but when I first got up there and finally got settled, and Francois, the student, left, there I was all by myself, couldn't really communicate with the people at all. They called me, because I wore a little hat, they called me commandant, which was pretty funny. And they felt, I think, a little sorry for me, despite the fact that they were so poor, so impoverished. There was so much alcoholism. It was a really difficult time for those Indians, because basically their traditional way of life had been destroyed by logging, and there was very little of it left. So there I was, and 3 families kind of adopted me, and I would spend all day with them and think, what should I photograph? Nothing is happening here. But eventually it was the human moments that really captured me. And over the 3 months, it was an amazing experience, which I must say, the other thing about it was I had no darkroom or means of developing the film. This was, of course, at that time, black and white film. And so I didn't really know what I was doing. I had never studied photography, and I couldn't see the pictures I was making. I was just, I mean, I didn't even know if they were exposed correctly. There was no way. So I was just there in an immersive experience for 3 months, and then went back to Montreal, and that's where I developed all the film, had some interaction with the National Film Board and so on, and of Canada, and began to print some of the pictures. And then I was invited to go out to British Columbia, and that's where I began to think about this work and wonder, well, what does it mean? And not having studied photography, or it was all such an intense experience and so new to me. It wasn't until some of the Native Americans in British Columbia in the Tsimshian tribe, which was quite a bit north of Vancouver, I think almost 700 miles north, inland from Prince Rupert, very remote area, yet the people there spoke English, could communicate with me, were much more tuned in to the politics of what was happening in Canada with First Nations people. And they began to ask me questions like, why isn't a Canadian making these pictures? Why isn't a First Nations person making these pictures? So that was pretty much my experience of a whole year in Northern Canada amongst the First Nations people, making photographs, and eventually coming to realize that this was a fraught series of work and I needed to think about it a lot. And then I wound up going to graduate school at the University of New Mexico. So that's kind of how that all unfolded.
What do you remember about the questions that you were raising for yourself about not only what that work meant, but maybe how you might continue to work?
Well, when I first went up there, I was very inspired by the very classical traditional work that the anthropologist Asen Balixi had done. And he is extremely well known for his films of the Nitsilic Eskimo. And in a way, that work is a little bit like the photographs of Edward Curtis. But when I came back from the experience and was mulling over these questions that my subjects had posed to me, I did read a book called Through Navajo Eyes. And that book is a really important book because it was about anthropologists giving film cameras to their subjects and letting those Navajo photograph and film themselves. And that book had a big influence on me. And it was the kind of question like, what's the perspective of your subject? How does the subject want to be seen?
What you're describing is the beginning of a process of you thinking deeply about your photographs, your position, the relationships between photographer and subject. And I think that those questions that were brewing were met soon in 1975 with graduate school, and with the history of photography, which may have been not the focus of your studies earlier. You in 1975 enrolled at the University of New Mexico, and the body of work that you had to show for admission was the work you made in Canada, but you were enrolling into a program that was not only sort of the leading photography program in the country at the time. We've got historian Beaumont Newhall teaching, but also it's an institution with artists like Tom Barrow, Betty Hahn, and Ann Noggle teaching on the faculty, who are making work that I don't think you could call social documentary by any stretch, and is very, very different. And so you're in this really interesting dynamic environment. You've also got students alongside you who are all bringing their work to show, and you're getting a whole bunch of new perspectives on photography that would be enriching and very different from maybe the experience you've had. And so I would imagine that those initial questions that you had raised for yourself were increasingly being kind of stimulated there, right? And you were also learning about photography's long history of, problematic ideas around colonialism and representation and the power dynamic going back to the beginning of photography. And so that probably started to help you crystallize a little bit of your thinking. And there's this, as I see it, and you will maybe see it similarly or maybe not, and you'll tell me, but there's, I think, kind of a transitional period with the first body of work you make in graduate school. And so I wanna have us look at some of those images, and you can tell me and us about your series, This is Horse Country, which in my understanding is sort of the first real body of work you did that first year of graduate school. So I would like you to describe what your interest was in this project, why you pursued it, and if you'd like to share a little bit about how you explained it to, or maybe what the response was, what the discussion was with your peers and with the faculty there, how it was received.
Well, when I first came to New Mexico, I just loved New Mexico and everything about it. So I decided to travel all over the state photographing cattle auctions. And it was kind of an exotic thing in a way, since I grew up in the East, to be around, cowboys and the animals, and, it was fun. And I was very much drawn to making portraits, as you see in the first picture here. And, in my classes, when I would have critiques with the other students, the students would really come at me and ask questions like, well, why did you want to make this photograph? And why did you photograph it this way? And I would say, well, I just love the expression on his face. But that's not what they were looking for, because so much of the photography that the other students and my professors were doing was about photography. And as you so aptly put it, not social documentary at all. So they couldn't really relate to the content of the pictures. They wanted to know, how was I framing them? What in the pictures was a commentary on photography? And those were ideas I wasn't really thinking about yet. So, in this second picture, where you have this man-animal confrontation, and there's, incredible light coming through the window, and that's a very photographic quality. And I also took some pictures with flash because it was quite dark in these places. And then the students would look at the flash pictures or a picture like this, and they'd start talking about the light and the way reality was transformed by the nature of the photograph. And so that was sort of waking me up to seeing in a different way. And then, of course, the questions that I had had about the First Nations Canadian photograph began to resurface again after studying. I mean, I did study with Beaumont Newhall, and I did study with Van Duren Koch. I took classes with Tom Barrow, which were very, very pointed. I also studied with Betty Hahn, but that was more learning about alternative processes. So it was the other professors that really pointed me to thinking about, where does documentary photography fit in? How does that relate to photography today? And then I began to think about, well, the exoticism of the cattle auctions, maybe that's not really what I want to be looking at. And I began to think about those power relationships. And instead of photographing difference from my own background, I began to wonder, what would it be like if I flipped the camera and turned it on my own milieu? What would that be like? So I started to go into banks and photograph in bank lobbies. I began to go into the banks in 77. And that became my master's project. The first place I photographed was actually a furniture store that sold contemporary office furniture, and it was called American Business Interiors. So that's what I titled the series. And I think you can see that photograph where these two men are back to back and in these chairs with extension cord and fire extinguisher in full view. And that's what really got me interested in photographing more of wealth and power in America rather than cowboys and Indians, which is how it actually turns out was what I was doing before. I was kind of situating myself within the West, finding, which the West has become my home, and I've now lived there for the greater part of my life. I love the West and could never imagine living in the East again. So I think that was part of my identity, searching for my identity as a photographer, as becoming a Westerner and that kind of thing.
We've been talking about how this was sort of a pivotal time for you where you were trying to find your way, and everything you just described kind of suggests that you were trying to figure out your own identity so then you could kind of determine when you're an insider and when you're an outsider, if that makes sense. I think you've done a really great job of talking about the questions that started to come up for you, and then how the history of photography started to inform that. And I also want to just bring up, you've said to me before, and maybe it's worth saying here, that one of the things that sort of clinched it for you, perhaps, or solidified this idea that maybe you could photograph sort of wealthy business people or in this other sort of world, was that your father was a CFO. You were comfortable circulating. You felt like you understood that kind of environment, and so you felt like you could move freely there. And that's not to say that you were always comfortable there, and there was certainly a gender dynamic and other things, and age, all of that. But it seemed like that was persuasive in you thinking about committing to this other direction in your work. Is that fair? That was sort of a contributing factor?
Yes.
Is that clear?
I really like the outsider insider idea. which I hadn't quite thought of in that way. I really felt like at first I didn't think about the bank photographs as being about wealth and power. I thought about them in terms of what would it be like if I photographed where I grew up, where I came from, my own milieu and background. And rather than what I was really thinking about was, so many of those Canadian photographs, they look so much like the Farm Security Administration photographs. And of course, Dorothea Lange was a great influence on me. And, and I thought about that power dynamic, about how as a white photographer with some economic privilege, when I took those photographs in Canada, those people had no idea what would happen with those photographs, how they were being portrayed. They were just clueless. And, that just didn't sit right with me. And I felt like I want to turn the camera and flip the script. I want to flip the script. Instead of having power over, I want to reflect on the powerful. And eventually this became clear to me by the time I went to Los Angeles, for sure. And I began what you said about whether we viewed corporate America and the wealthy as being what was kind of the default America, or whether it was dominant. That was important for me as well, because one of the early pictures I made was this picture taken in a savings and loan with a microfiche machine. But the reason I took the picture was because of the tapestry that had the Statue of Liberty. And I thought, that's such an iconic American symbol. And I want to have that in the photograph. So, and then of course, I decided to go, after I'd gotten my master's degree, I decided to go to Los Angeles because I felt like that's where you could see the future before it happened.
You wanted to even though you had completed your thesis for the University of New Mexico, this was sort of an energizing subject for you to keep working on and continue to explore. You went briefly to Denver, made some pictures there, and then in 78 moved to Los Angeles, I believe. Is that correct? You're nodding. Good. Okay. And I really like the idea that you said this is where you could see the future sort of happening, because as we'll talk about momentarily, that idea comes through in a lot of the pictures you made there. But I think the important thing to kind of pivot here is around the time you got there, another photographer, John Humble, was putting together an application for an NEA survey grant, focusing on Los Angeles, because the bicentennial of the founding of the city, the sort of American city we know, was in 1781. So 1981 was coming up. And in order to celebrate that, the proposal looked at surveying the entire city and with 8 different photographers. So each photographer would sort of survey the city in his or her signature way. You were the only her in that group. In 79 and 80, and then this would be exhibited in 81 on that bicentennial. And the grant application described the project as, quote, a visual examination of the sociological and topographical diversity of one of the most dynamic and unusual cities in the world. And you were the only woman, as I've said, and there were other familiar photographers, Joe Deal, Robert Flick, Douglas Hill, John Humble, Bill Owens, Max Yavno, Guzmano Cesaretti. And at the end, there was this portfolio of 120 photographs total. Each of you contributed sort of a sub-portfolio. Yours had 15 photographs, and your portfolio title at that time was the Capital Group for that group. That was exhibited in 1981. That those 120 photographs went into the collection of the NEA, as was the regular procedure at the time. And then in 1990, that entire body of work was transferred from the NEA to the Smithsonian. So that's where those 15 photographs you made are now. So that's just to sort of trace the trajectory of that smaller body of work. And while most of those other photographers are really well known for photographing sort of street photography or the suburbs or the beaches, kind of outdoor life in California, fewer people had photographed interiors and business interiors in this sort of new LA downtown. That's not what I think most people thought of when they thought of California survey photography. It was very much, at least outside, that was sort of a basic condition. And you're the only one who photographed interiors, of course, based on this project you had already started. And so you went indoors, you photographed the offices of defense contractors, law firms, financial organizations, the aerospace industry, record labels. Something that's very evident in all of these photographs, and we're going to look through the 5 that we've acquired and some additional ones, but you're very attentive, I would say very, very attentive to the geometry of every picture. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the elements here and the composition, and I'm really interested in the way that this sofa almost captures the viewer as well.
Well, the composition became very, very important, and how I approached these interiors in terms of framing, perspective, and how all the elements would work together. And it was a kind of strategy for me to make these interiors look as sterile and isolating as I possibly could. And this was really the first time that I moved away from photographing people. In the whole suite of 15 photographs, there are only 2 photographs that have people in them. And it was interesting that you chose to acquire 5 pictures that did not include people at all. So you were obviously very much aware of how important the space was in terms of expressing ideas about wealth, power, corporate America, power structures in the US, that kind of thing. So in the title image, the capital group of the portfolio of 15 photographs, that whole picture is based on circles. And there's something, I think at the time, those kinds of sofas, those modular sofas were really kind of avant-garde for the period. But the way I photograph it, it's almost kind of creepy that it wants to come out and sort of, suck you in like an octopus or some sea creature. And you do see LA City Hall through the one circle. And I was, it was the kind of thing I would aim my camera, I would watch the reflections in the table, for example, and that surface, that shiny surface. And I think it's also important that in most of the pictures that I took of the 15, you cannot see outside. So there's a claustrophobia to the spaces. So they're very swept clean, except maybe for an ashtray here or there. And there's the way the rugs have a sheen to them, and the textures and the surfaces. And, it just, there's a perfection that I tried to create as well. It just had to all come together in a way where nothing looked incidental. Every element, every detail counted and reflected upon each other.
And that's also evident in the photograph you made of the lobby of Architectural Digest, where we see the frames of the works on the wall reflected in the shiny chrome table, There are lines throughout kind of connecting objects and perspectives. And I also appreciate the shape of the drinking fountain and its inclusion, both because it is also kind of it almost frames itself in that black surround, and it also is this metallic surface, much like the coffee table and that ashtray. And it seems like it belongs in the picture as an element that was selected to be there as part of the design as well.
I see that picture as, well, there's a lot of humor as well as incisive commentary in these photographs. And in this particular picture, it was not lost on me that this is Architectural Digest, right? That, puts out that beautiful magazine and is at, a very high status, elegant place, you would think. And so I made the picture so it would be a digest of the architecture. And to me, that was very funny. And that water fountain is so key because it's a very mundane pedestrian water fountain. It's not fancy at all. And I photographed it so it becomes like the artworks on the wall. And even the reflection of the one frame in the tabletop pointing in the actual print, that water fountain is so precisely printed because you have black against black, right? And so, this is back in the darkroom days where you would dodge and burn. And I had a little burning tool that I cut specifically for that water fountain so that I could make the base, the black base, separate from the black background. And that was absolutely key to me to have that happen. So it's really kind of a fun picture that way.
I think so too. We also see a lot of executive offices that are decorated with interesting trophies or symbols, different kinds of things that are meaningful to the occupant. At A&M Records, we see the desk here, and we also see an airplane, which I think appears in a few of the photographs, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we've also got this megaphone, which oddly, I think is part of the logo of RCA Records, with the little dog listening to the phonograph. I guess it's not a megaphone. There are gold records on the wall, which are actually awards. And then we have this airplane, which I think we see in a number of photographs. And it's interesting to me that I'm not really sure what this has to do with being an executive, but we see again and again symbols of adventure and conquest. And we see airplanes, which, for much of the 20th century were symbols of kind of the latest technology and adventure. And then later on, we'll see a real concentration on space and the final frontier. We've got, photographs of Mars. We've got posters of the moon. And so this all seems to be sort of the domain of the 1970s executive decor. I think these symbols, when we see them again and again, we have to start sort of paying attention to them. Certainly the airplanes and the space kind of concentration. I think we see it perhaps more obviously in the next photograph at Northrop Corporation. And I know you have a lot to say about this photograph. This has a photograph, one of those first photographs taken on Mars, on the surface of Mars in 1976 by the Viking mission. There was Viking 1 and Viking 2, the two spacecraft that went to Mars at the same time, and those first photographs that came out. I'm guessing that's a color photograph. There's sort of a famous color photograph, the first color photograph taken on Mars in 76. There's also a fighter jet sort of pointed at the Earth, the Moon, and Mars. And we see those on those smoky pedestals again, made of that, either glass or acrylic, that allows us to see outside in the sort of residential area in El Segundo around what is probably a towering office building in that area. Tell me a little bit about these elements and what they say to you about what Northrop Corporation does, and how it sort of expresses the business of that company and what you saw in this office.
Well, to go back for a moment to A&M Records, I want to mention, I think it was very important for the 15 group portfolio to represent Hollywood. That's a very big part of Los Angeles. So aside from A&M Records, I also made a picture of Vidal Sassoon's offices, which is a very fun picture too. But the planes in the two pictures are entirely different. And you're right, the megaphone in A&M Records is very reminiscent of RCA, but it's also a symbol of the ability to speak, right? Yeah. The ability to be heard, the ability to project, to have authority. And the plane, I think, is mobility and the ability to go places, to have access to places that other people couldn't afford to go. So there's that element. And then all the awards on the wall, A&M Records, all their gold records. And there's 3 awards shown, just like there's 3 globes in Northrop. There's something about, a triangle, a tripod with 3 legs, when you have 3 things put together, it's very, very strong. And it so happens with the Northrop picture that it's I think it's the only picture I used a fill flash with. And at the time, I didn't know that was going to create that shadow on the fighter plane. Now, Northrop made fighter jets. So it's in camouflage. It's in a room with this textured surface on the walls that's like a moonscape. And it is aimed at Mars, the Earth, and the Moon. So I can't think of anything closer to conquest and even attack. It's poised to attack, and that shadow makes it even more malicious and dangerous looking. There is a small carpet on the floor that echoes in the border of the carpet. It's an oriental carpet in the lower right, echoes the shape of the fighter plane. And then there's even a little tiny X, which is like a target. And I love that combination of all those elements. And the only reason you can see outside at all is the pedestals are, I believe, acrylic, and they're smoked. And so they act like neutral density filters, and they cut down the bright light of the outside, because you can't see very much outside at all. And so this is it's really one of my favorite pictures.
I want to look at the last photograph that we acquired, Atlantic Richfield Company. And this has a very complex organization of elements as well. And what I'd like to ask you about in this photograph is how, in some cases, you requested that certain things be moved and organized for the picture. And in this case, who helped you, what you moved, who helped you, why you wanted it to be moved, and who we're not seeing and outside of the frame, and what that might sort of add to our understanding of this photograph.
Atlantic Richfield was I believe one of the Fortune 500, very, very major company in Los Angeles at the time. And this is the lobby to the CEO office. And so someone accompanied me into this space. Usually I was left alone in spaces to photograph, and usually I did not use a tripod. But in this case, it was such an interesting space, and it was filled with original artworks. That is a real Calder, and the screen to the right, the pyramid on the table, are both plated in 24 karat gold. And so there was a guard, a black man, dressed immaculately in a suit, wearing white gloves, who accompanied me into the space. And in that space, there was not only the pyramid, but there was also a sphere and a cube. And they also were all plated with 24 karat gold. I mean, it was an amazing space, such an amazing space that when I finally left, I imagined that somebody was going to come and vacuum my footprints up to erase any human presence. But when I saw the pyramid, I thought, wow, I wonder if they would allow me to have that put on the table. So I asked if it could be moved onto the table. Usually I didn't get things moved around, but in this case, when I saw that, I wanted to. And of course, there's that pyramid is also on the dollar bill, right? And so this black man, I thought I could move it, but he said, oh no, let me do it, and he's wearing his white gloves and he places it on the table. I did say take a few photographs of him. That's who we don't see on the outside. Okay. But I never printed those photographs. I just like the space, and I like the fact that the artwork on the wall to the left looks like, a graph of the financial pie. It's all about those things. No people at all in the space, but just these sort of glowing objects, and especially that pyramid and what it signifies.
Right. So these works were included in that 15 print portfolio and exhibited in 1981. And you had a few other exhibitions around the time of this work. But it wasn't really well known until just recently. So in 2018, you published this work you published some of the work from Los Angeles, but you broadened it to include some of that earlier work all the way back to Albuquerque in 2018 in a book called Executive Order, Images of 1970s Corporate America. And I want to just look at some of the other photographs that appear in the book. So now we're looking at images that aren't part of our collection, but I think are really interesting images from the book. And I have kind of specific comments or kind of questions to talk about for each of these handful of photographs. I want to talk about Countdown Los Angeles, which I really like. One thing that's sort of different about this photograph from the five we've talked about so far is that it's noticeably less of a glamorous space, a highly designed space. Now, it might be the corner of a highly designed office. We don't know that from this photograph, but this looks like a fairly mundane corner. Here we have this interest in space exploration again. We're walking on the moon, but it's what you did with the title that really wraps it up together and makes it quite humorous or dark. You've got these notebooks here, and you're calling it Countdown, but we noticed that the numbers are out of order, which would be catastrophic if this were actually a countdown. Is there something else you'd like to add about this particular one?
Well, a couple of things I'd like to add about the group and what led to the book. I really never put this work away for decades. I never felt uneasy about this work at all, the way I did about that earlier work. But I went on and did a lot of other photography. And so it was kind of in the background until I met Michael Itkoff of Daylight Books. And he loved this work and said, let's do a book. So that's how the book came about. And that, because of doing the book, I worked on the book for a whole year in terms of selecting the pictures. And I actually went back to my negatives. And so this picture, Countdown, was one I had made a little 8x10 work print of it and never did anything more with it. And I couldn't even find the negative for it. But when I saw it and saw the notebooks out of order, I thought, wow, I want that to be in the book. That is just so funny. And it fits with the other aerospace kinds of pictures. And you're right, this is more of a plebeian workspace. And, when I went back through this, here was a series of pictures that I had worked on for 3 years before I went to LA and a little bit after. So, it's a very big body of work. And there were pictures where I focused on the people. There were pictures where I photographed secretaries and people who were not the powerful. And, I carefully culled a perhaps very specialized selection for the Los Angeles Documentary Project and what I did that year. But when you look at the whole body of work, in its entirety, there's a lot more diversity to it. And so I put that into the book. And aside from what you and I have both commented on in Countdown, I can make one other observation, which is because I went back to this work and was looking at some pictures that either I had made little work prints or not even printed it at all and was selecting from negatives, I could not recall for many of the earlier pictures exactly what business I had photographed in. So I came up with these sort of quirky titles. And only in the Los Angeles Documentary Project do I have the actual venues in which I photographed. Throughout the book, I have kind of funny titles like Countdown or like Diver and so on.
And you have just introduced us to many of the topics I want to talk about with you as we go through these next few photographs. You've really done a good job of sort of summarizing the next few minutes of our conversation. Because the next photograph, System Development Corporation, first of all, we noticed the sort of futuristic graphic on the wall. And there's a lot we could talk about here, but what I would like to talk about is this person here. So we see this person, we're encountering a human now for the first time in this talk. I believe you asked this person to come into this room and sit there. So I would like you to just say something about how frequently you interacted with people and perhaps envisioned them in a particular way in that environment and asked them to cooperate with you and how they perhaps responded to that.
Well, in this case, the minute I saw this room, which is kind of a showcase room for this defense firm in Santa Monica, I wanted to photograph in there because of that graphic on the wall, because of the way the computer, which looks so tiny and innocuous to us today, the way it was featured on that desk with all the chairs aimed in at it, and then a TV monitor up on the wall, which could be surveillance, it could be for showing some kind of informative video, who knows. But this guy was walking down the hallway, and that's their showcase room. It's a special room where they invite people in, to have presentations. When I saw him, I said, "Oh, would you mind sitting in this room?" And he immediately looked uncomfortable. And I knew he felt like, "Oh, I'm not really allowed in that room, am I?" So I kind of cajoled him to get into the room and sit down. And I saw how uncomfortable he looked, and I loved that. I mean, I just thought that's what made the photograph, that he had that demeanor. In the next one, which is Honeywell, I had a really amazing experience there, because when I met that fellow who was an engineer at Honeywell, I thought he looked like Einstein with his hair. And I asked him if I could photograph him, and he said, "Well, can you come back tomorrow?" And because he wasn't wearing a suit. And So he said, I'd like to put a suit on, and we could really do a photograph in here. And so I'm all excited to come back the next day. And in my mind, I had pictured him in a black suit. I walk in, and here he is with this white hair and this white suit and these white machines. And it just blew me away. I couldn't believe it. And then I asked him to pick up this. At the time, this is some sort of a big floppy disk. They were quite a bit larger, than they got smaller and smaller and smaller, right? So I asked him if he would hold it. And the way he's holding it, it's, a lot of times you think of men in power as having a kind of phallic energy, but he's holding this as if he's giving birth to it, as if it's kind of like the womb. And I just love that as well. So because it kind of changed the whole gender dynamics of the picture. And so in a way, these are the only two pictures that had people in them from the 15 print portfolio, and they both happen to be in technical environments.
Of course, this whole project, the photographs are really laden with these signifiers of class and race and gender hierarchy imposed by the dominant white male American executive, which I think is really what this guy kind of embodies, right? This seems like that guy that we think of as the person at the top of that sort of constructed hierarchy in these offices. And from the conversations I've had with you and from other interviews I've looked at with you and things I've read, it seems like right from the start, from your own statement about the project back to 1980, you were really aware of kind of power dynamics around wealth and class. But it seems like it was only later, maybe putting together the book, that the sort of racial and gender inequities became much more obvious to you, not only in the pictures you took, but in what was missing. I think at one point you commented in an interview, it was only later I realized I never photographed a female executive. I just never encountered one, right? And so in some of the photographs that you selected in that edit for your book in 2018, we do start to see some of that later reconsideration appear. And so I think one of the photographs that really demonstrates this is Filmways. Could you tell us what you see going on here in this photograph? And also, did you see that going on when you took the photograph, or was this something that you absorbed over time?
I think in this case, it was so glaringly obvious that I did see it at the time, that here's a Black woman in this, I don't know what you call those, but she's a receptionist, and she's totally enclosed, almost like in a box or a cage. And this white male executive, his nonchalant way of leaning on their sort of asserting that his ownership. It's really interesting that they both have their hands clasped, but I think the way they're clasped and the directions of the gazes are things that are very different. And here you really have a sense of the male gaze, which I wouldn't have been able to term that way when I took the photograph, even though I had read Laura Mulvey. That's the right person, right? Yeah. And in graduate school, but I don't think I would have thought of it that way. But then, and I showed this photograph to some people, and they said, wow, look at the way she's looking at him. He's looking at you. He can't see the way she's looking at him. So that's pretty interesting. And she's, I think, looking at him in a sort of sardonic, quizzical kind of way, that she never would use that glance if he could see her. So there's all those dynamics which are so interesting. And then, of course, because it's Filmways, it's about film, right? It's about not only Hollywood and glamour and all that, but it's about film and it's about photography. And also there's a reflection in the mirror to the far, far left. And you can see the back of the executive, and you can see her in the in where she's enclosed. You can see that in the mirror. So it doubles everything. And I think that doubling is also really interesting.
Well, and you're bringing up the idea of the male gaze is really interesting here, because typically when we think about that, that idea of the male gaze, it's the male artist gazing at a female subject. And here you're the person behind the camera. But what's interesting is he's looking back at you because he assumes that he is the subject of this photograph. I want to just look at 3 more pictures from the series, and then we can start to kind of put it together with what you've been doing lately and how you've sort of reckoned with these photographs over time. But I do want to look at one of the early photographs going back to Albuquerque, Languid Blonde. And again, maybe you gave this that title, not that specific title, but that title because you couldn't remember exactly where you were. But the title Languid Blonde is definitely, I think you're intentionally kind of objectifying this person because that's how you saw women often being objectified in office settings. And I just want to read something back to you that you said to a different interviewer that I thought was really right on. You said, I was really aware of some of the women. It seems that they tried to present themselves, where they tried to make themselves alluring. And that was a way for some of the women to have power at that time through their sexuality. And so I wonder if this is an example that you think might kind of express the way that women who maybe were not, who tried but could not get traction in terms of success as a corporate executive and achieve that same status, had to sort of make their presence known in through their sexuality. Is this a photograph that speaks to you that way? Or tell us what you were thinking when you took this photograph and titled it Languid Blonde.
I very much see this woman in the way you described, as trying to exert power through her sexuality and being alluring. And you can see that in the way she's sitting in the chair, her body language, the way she has her hand on her knee, which calls attention, in the curve of her body. And it's a sort of S curve, which is kind of classic, the way it comes down and leads to her knees and her legs. And by having both her arms outstretched like that, she's open. Her body language is she's receptive, and she's also got a scoop neck on her dress. So all of those things, and the way her head is slightly cocked, she has a lot of makeup on, her hair is just immaculately combed and arranged. And then you have a television in the background, which sort of alludes to, there's nothing on the screen, but in a way she's on the screen, right? In this photograph. And look how big the ashtray is compared to her head. It's kind of funny. So she's surrounded by all these accoutrements and objects and furniture, and she becomes a part of the furniture. So she has to sort of take her body and not relax into the chair, or she would just be decoration, don't you think?
Right. Well, and I love the way, if you compare that photograph to the next one here, Olympia, which you say the title comes from the typewriter, you've noted that you also sensed some subtle resistance amongst some of the female employees. This is taken in 78 or 79. We do have to pay attention to the fact that the women's movement in America was gaining some traction. Ms. Magazine had recently started publishing, and this woman, it's a moment in time. There's a confluence of potential coincidence here, but the result is we've got this negative symbol on the wall, this X, this no, and she's very, casually, but I would say perhaps provocatively wielding this letter opener, which is the secretary's tool of opening the mail, but is also kind of this challenging dagger. And to me, this is a real hilarious picture, but also one that's perhaps meaningful in the way that a lot of women felt they had to play certain roles in offices, and there were certainly limitations on the roles that were available to them, and certainly not all of them were happy about it. What else can you tell me about this picture?
Well, aside from the fact that it is an Olympia typewriter, I also like the idea of calling it Olympia to elevate the picture and, put it into that mythological realm. And also, when you think about Olympia, in that famous painting of Olympia, right? Is it Degas?
Is it Manet?
Oh, it's Manet. It's Manet, I think. And that's a picture where a woman is in a subservient position, right? But here she's holding this letter opener like it's a weapon. And I didn't tell her to do that. I know I do tell people what to do a lot of times, but she did that on her own. And unlike the previous photograph, where the woman is so coiffed perfectly, this woman looks kind of like your ordinary neighbor, right? You could see her, out watering the lawn or something, not as a fashion model. And but look at how her desk, everything is so perfectly arranged. There's not a paper out of place. And the big X, that's what really drew me to wanting to photograph her. And then she picks up this weapon, and she looks like a gentle, innocent soul, but suddenly she's got this weapon, right? So and I learned a lot about the dynamics that dealt with race and gender when I was putting the book together. A lot of it was not too apparent to, I was aware there weren't any women executives, for sure. That was very clear.
I don't want to skip over this last picture in your book, which is Please Ring Bell for Service. I don't think it's giving it away, but this is the only picture where we see a little piece of you, and I see your feet there reflected in the mirrored front of that desk. And did your experience making these photographs, was it what you expected? Did you find yourself comfortable in these environments like you thought you might? Were they familiar to you ultimately? And just circulating through these spaces is something you thought that could bring you closer to that idea of making sure you were in spaces where there was really no chance of you exploiting your subjects, because in fact, the power was certainly with the residents of these offices, these executives. And so there's a lot to kind of think about there, but there you are in that office. And when you look back at that year or those years, do you have an idea of it sort of turning out like you thought it might when you pivoted that direction around 76, 77? Sort of, what was your reflection about making that shift around that time? Not now and not 5 years ago, but maybe standing there, seeing your feet there, kind of, what was your feeling about photographing people that were more, you felt more like an insider amongst them in some ways, but maybe you also felt like an outsider in other ways?
Well, it's really interesting that you say that, because even though it was a world that was familiar to me. It was never a world that was comfortable to me. And so in this photograph, and I never did take a self-portrait where I show my face for this work. This is the only picture that I took where I included myself. And look how I made myself so diminutive. It's not, it's not a powerful person, you know, it's, and look at the shoes I'm wearing, you know, I think they're hush puppies. They're those suede tie shoes. So they're not the kind of shoes that a woman would wear in these spaces, which goes back to the fact that the world that I grew up in Philadelphia, um, was a world of second generation immigrants, my parents, that had tremendous desire for upward mobility, to the point where uh, my mother, if it were at all possible, would have liked for me to be a debutante. Meanwhile, I was a tomboy and I rebelled, and I couldn't wait to get away from Philadelphia and get away from my family. I mean, it's just true. We later on came together and resolved all that, but I felt very uncomfortable in that world. Um, to this day, I never wear dresses. And um, so when I went into these spaces, I felt all of that pressure to conform to be a certain kind of person. And that was not the person who I was. I am looking for the authentic. And I don't see these kinds of people as being authentic. I see it as being all facade. And that also makes me very uncomfortable. So it's really kind of funny that I never wanted to go back to the Indian Reserve because it was so difficult for me to live there and see how the people were suffering. But here, I never wanted to go back because there was a part of me that despised this world, if that makes sense to you.
It really does make sense. It's interesting you talk about not wanting to go back because you have revisited not those geographical places, but you've revisited both of those projects. And we'll talk about that in a second. But I also want to bring up that the work you've done, some of which you just mentioned, but specifically a project that continues thinking about and is maybe the culmination of, or the sort of natural outcome of the kind of consumerism we were looking at in your executive order project, and how it sort of manifested decades later in sort of consumer culture back in California. In the last 10 years or so, you've been working on a project called High End. And we're just going to look at two pictures as an example. Interested people out there will find more on your website, but just in terms of linking this back to the executive order work, we just have two examples here. We've got this photograph called The Market in Santa Monica, and another called Guard Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. And could you just give us a really brief kind of introduction to this work so that when we look at more, we'll understand those connections and through lines to this work?
Okay. Well, I always have The Market as my introductory picture to this series of work, which is still ongoing, and I have done more pictures in Europe as well. But I got the idea of what would it be like to go back to LA in 2012. And when I went back, I decided to photograph outside, and I love the light there. The light is so incredible. And what it does, or what I've been able to do with the light in photographing these outdoor spaces, which invariably have a lot of signage, as well as people and symbolic objects in them, is that I've been able to create the sense of a stage setting, that it's hyper real. And with the title High End, I'm really thinking about the end, like apocalyptic shopping. This is how it seems to me. And so this picture of the market, I love the fact this is in the Santa Monica Mall. And I love that architecturally there's that column with which looks like a curtain has been drawn back from the stage. And then in the background, it says now playing everywhere, because this consumerism is playing everywhere, right? The man on Rodeo Drive, the lighting is quite a bit different because I'm shooting into a storefront, and they have, because of the climate, they're able to have a lot of open air stores where they just have a chain kind of thing that comes down to lock it up. But when they're open, and anybody could walking by could grab something. So they have to have, so he's not a shopper, he's a guard. And it was Michelle Beaugray who wrote an article about this work, and she pointed out to me, I hadn't really noticed how his hand is in a fist, how his pants are too long. And there's so much tension in that guard staring at these white mannequins with, all this pink frilly female stuff that's basically for white people in Beverly Hills. So there's a lot going on in the dynamics, I think, in both these photographs.
Okay, Susan, we're getting close to wrapping up. And so before we go, I want to just take a moment to reflect on the ways that you have revisited both of these projects. And so before we sort of wrap up the executive order project, which we've talked about a lot, I do want to make sure we mention that you also revisited that work you made in Canada. I'm just wondering if you could say a few words about why you decided to revisit that work over so many decades, and how that time allowed you to kind of, if not resolve, at least get to a place where you understood that work a little bit better and were ready to possibly share it with others.
Well, there are a couple things that happened here. Is that, yeah, I literally put this work away in a drawer and didn't look at it for many, many years. And then when I took it out and started to look at it and think about it again, I began to think about, like, well, maybe there should be an archive of this work. Maybe this work documents a moment in time for these people on this reserve that's important for people to know about. We don't want to erase that history. We want to change their circumstances and ameliorate things, definitely, but we don't want to erase it. So I began to work on this portfolio with a fellow who does wonderful scanning of negatives and digital printing in Santa Fe at Rush Creek Editions, which is Steve Zeifman, my printer for big prints. And we talked about doing a box set portfolio. And then I realized, well, if I'm going to do this, I'll design the portfolio case, but how am I going to sequence the work? How am I going to sequence it? What's going to go with it to explain it? And so I wrote a text. I had to write about it. And there are pages in the portfolio, an introduction, a few pages that combine photographs with text. And I wanted to, that text talks about my experience, talks about the traditional way of life that had been destroyed for these people by logging, etc. So I had to put it together that way. And then I contacted the Library Archives of Canada and asked them if they were interested in an archive for the people and for posterity. And so they said yes, and they bought one of these portfolios, and I donated all the contact sheets and my notes, and I wanted to give them my film as well, so that, and it's all there and it's preserved. And I think that's just really great, because now people can study this period. They can share it with a lot of people, including the First Nations people, and it's important. So that's what enabled me to go back and do this, because I had to present it in a certain way and give access to it in a way that would be meaningful and important for the future.
We're glad to know about that. And I just want to thank you for spending all of this time. And I wonder if you have any final words similarly about the process of coming back to this work you made in LA and Albuquerque and a little bit in Denver, and what you learned from going back and examining the work, that you maybe what is something that surprised you 40 years later, and some depth of understanding you came to that perhaps totally passed you by when you first made the work.
Well, I think, first of all, I think anyone can benefit by looking back at work that they did earlier, because you change, the world changes, and I know so much more now than I did then. And also the experience of going back to Los Angeles and photographing in those shopping malls made me think about this work also in new ways, the earlier work, the black and white work. But, I do see that it's an important, again, it's evidence, it's a document of a period of time, but it's a period of time that really resonates with today. And I think it's the way it resonates today that is probably my biggest insight about it now. Because we are being so much more, I think there's so much more thoughtfulness. And I don't recall that from back then. I don't recall as much of that self-reflexivity in terms of our culture. There are real movements now to change things. The Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, this is all going on today, and there's a kind of self-awareness and awareness of how certain people have been so disenfranchised for so long. And we didn't have that awareness before. And I think this black and white work, this corporate work, gives us another window into that, the very things we're examining right now. Do you agree?
I do. And I'm really glad that I have become familiar with it. And it's, I think I've told you before that I was surprised to see it not so long ago. And it was a surprise because it was work that I certainly would have paid attention to had I seen it earlier, but I'm so glad that it came back around when you decided to publish your book.
Thank you so much for all of your wonderful insights that you've brought to all this work. And I love the way you've been able to tie things together from different moments in my life and my photography, and which is something I'm working on right now, thinking about doing a retrospective book and hopefully exhibition of all my work, and how does it all fit together. And you've helped so much with that. And thank you for your time and for acquiring this work. And I'm so pleased to have it in the Harry Ransom Center.
Well, we are thrilled to have it, I can say, for everyone. And I would just like to thank you for everything you've shared with us today. It's 5 photographs, but much more surrounding this work. And we're thrilled to have them. And I'm thrilled to know about all of the working and thinking you've done all around this project. So thanks very much. Thanks for joining us, Susan.
Thank you.